Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the moment the runner comes back isn't the moment you think it is? Not a sudden message. Not an apology. Not even a clear reunion. Let me ask you something. Why do so many people wait for the runner to return, only to feel confused when they do? Why does it sometimes feel different, quieter, almost unexpected? And here's the real question. What if the runner doesn't come back because they changed, but because you did? Because here's the truth most people never realize. The runner doesn't return when you want them to. They return when there's nothing left to run from. So the real question is not, when will they come back? But, have I become someone they no longer need to escape? Chapter 1. The illusion of the runner coming back. Why it's not what you think. There is a moment that almost everyone on this journey imagines. A moment that feels like the answer to everything. The moment the runner comes back. You picture it clearly. A message appears. A conversation begins. Distance dissolves. You imagine relief. Clarity. Closure. A sense that everything finally makes sense. And beneath all of that, there is a deeper expectation. That when the runner returns, everything will change. That the confusion will disappear. That the dynamic will stabilize. That the connection will finally become what it was always meant to be. Because for so long, it felt like they were the missing piece. The one who pulled away. The one who created the distance. The one who needed to come back for things to finally move forward. But this is where the illusion begins. Because what you are waiting for is not what you think it is. The idea of the runner coming back creates a very specific image. An image where they change first. Where they realize something. Where they return with clarity. Where they are ready in a way they weren't before. And that image places the focus entirely on them. On what they will do. On what they will say. On when they will return. But the truth is not in that image. Because the runner does not come back in the way you imagine. Not as a sudden shift. Not as a dramatic moment. Not as a clear turning point where everything becomes different overnight. And most importantly, not because they changed first. This is the part that most people struggle to understand. Because the mind is wired to look outward. To look for cause and effect. To believe that if something changes externally, it must have been initiated externally. So it feels logical to assume that when the runner comes back, it is because they decided to. Because they realized something. Because they changed. But the connection does not work that way. It is not driven by actions. It is driven by energy. And energy does not shift because someone decides it should. It shifts because something within the dynamic changes. And that change does not begin with them. It begins with you. Think about what the runner dynamic actually is. It is not about one person who runs and one person who chases. It is about imbalance. One person's energy is extended outward, reaching, seeking, trying to move the connection forward. And the other person responds by creating space. Not because they do not feel the connection, but because they feel it too intensely. Because the energy is not stable. Because the pressure is too much. And that pressure does not always come from actions. It comes from expectation. From focus. From the subtle energy of wanting something to happen. And as long as that energy exists, the dynamic remains. The runner continues to run. Because there is something to run from. But here is the truth. The runner does not come back because they suddenly stop running. They come back because there is nothing left to run from. And that is a completely different perspective. Because it shifts the focus away from them. And brings it back to you. What were they running from? Not the connection. But the energy within it. The intensity. The pressure. The imbalance. And that energy is not created by one person. It is created by the dynamic itself. So if that dynamic does not change, the outcome does not change either. Even if the runner returns temporarily, the same pattern will repeat. The same push and pull. The same cycles. Because the underlying energy is still the same. And this is why the idea of the runner coming back as a solution is an illusion. Because it assumes that their return is what creates change. But in reality, their return is the result of change. And that change happens before they come back. Not after. It happens when the dynamic shifts. When the energy stabilizes. When the imbalance dissolves. And that shift does not happen externally. It happens internally. Within you. Think about how your experience used to feel. The constant thinking. The need to understand what they were doing. The desire for clarity. The attachment to a specific outcome. All of that created movement. Energy that was not at rest. Energy that was reaching. And that reaching created pressure. Even if it was not expressed. Even if it was not visible. It was felt. And that feeling is what the runner responded to. But now something begins to change. Not because you forced it. Not because you decided to stop caring. But because the need itself starts to dissolve. You are no longer thinking in the same way. You are no longer trying to understand everything. You are no longer waiting for something to happen. And because of that, your energy shifts. It returns to you. It becomes grounded, stable, at rest. And when your energy is no longer reaching, there is nothing left creating pressure. Nothing left to run from. And this is the moment where everything changes. Not because they decided to come back, but because the dynamic that kept them away no longer exists. And from that place, their return is not a dramatic event. It is a natural response, a reflection of the shift that has already happened. And this is why it feels different, quieter, less intense, more grounded, because you are no longer experiencing it from the same state. You are not the same person who was waiting, who was chasing, who was trying to understand everything. You are stable, present, not needing anything to happen. And from that place, their return does not feel like a resolution. It feels like a continuation of something that has already settled within you. So if you find yourself waiting for the runner to come back, imagining how it will feel, believing that it will change everything, pause and look deeper. Because the real shift does not happen when they return. It happens when there is nothing left to run from. And that begins with you. Not by trying to change them. Not by trying to control the connection. But by returning to yourself. Fully. Because the moment your energy is no longer reaching is the moment the dynamic dissolves. And when the dynamic dissolves, the runner does not need to run anymore. And that is when they come back. Not as a solution, but as a reflection of what has already changed within you. Chapter 2. Why the runner left in the first place. It was never what you thought. When the runner pulls away, the mind immediately tries to explain it. They don't feel the same. They're not ready. They're afraid of commitment. Something must have gone wrong. These explanations feel logical. They give you something to hold on to. A reason that makes sense on the surface. But beneath those explanations, there is a deeper truth. The runner did not leave because they didn't feel the connection. They left because they felt it too much. And that is the part that most people struggle to understand. Because from your perspective, the connection felt powerful, meaningful, something worth exploring, something that should naturally bring you closer. So if it felt real to you, why would they move away? Why would they create distance instead of closeness? The answer is not in the absence of feeling. It is in the intensity of it. Think about what happens when something within you is activated too quickly. When emotions rise faster than your ability to process them. When something touches a part of you that is not fully stable. The natural response is not always to move closer. It is often to create space. Not because you want to lose it, but because you don't know how to hold it. And this is exactly what happens in the runner dynamic. The connection does not just bring two people together. It brings everything within them to the surface. Old wounds, unresolved emotions, patterns that were never fully understood, beliefs about love, trust, vulnerability. And when all of that is activated at once, it can feel overwhelming, not in a way that is obvious, but in a way that creates discomfort. A sense that something is too much, too fast, too intense. And when that feeling arises, the instinct is to move away, to create distance, to regain control. Not because the connection is unwanted, but because the experience is not yet manageable. This is why the runner leaves. Not as a rejection of you, but as a response to what they are feeling within themselves. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because from the outside, it looks like they are pulling away from the connection. But in reality, they are pulling away from their own internal response to it. The intensity, the activation, the parts of themselves that the connection is bringing up. And this is why trying to understand their actions through logic often leads nowhere. Because their actions are not logical. They are energetic. They are emotional. They are responses to something deeper than what is visible. Now, here is where it becomes even more important to understand the dynamic. Because the runner is not the only one being activated. You are too. But the way you respond is different. Instead of creating distance, you may have moved closer. You may have wanted to understand it, to explore it, to hold on to it. And that creates a polarity. One person moves toward. The other moves away. Not because one feels more than the other, but because each person processes intensity differently. And this creates the dynamic. The more one moves forward, the more the other feels the need to step back. Not as a decision, but as a response. Because the energy is not balanced. There is movement. There is pressure. There is a sense that something is happening, but not in a stable way. And this is why the runner leaves. Not because the connection is not real, but because the energy within it is not yet aligned. There is too much activation, too much intensity, too much happening beneath the surface. And without stability, that intensity cannot sustain closeness. It creates distance. This is the part that changes everything once you truly see it. Because it shifts your perspective. From "they left me" to "they were overwhelmed." From "they don't want this" to "they don't know how to hold this yet." And that shift removes the idea of rejection. It removes the belief that something was missing. It removes the need to question the connection itself. Because the connection was never the issue. The ability to hold it was. And that ability is not developed through interaction. It is developed through separation, through space, through time spent away from the intensity, where each person can process what was activated, without the constant presence of the other. Because when the connection is active, everything is amplified. Every emotion, every thought, every pattern. And that amplification makes it difficult to see clearly. Difficult to understand what is actually happening. But in separation, that amplification quiets down. And in that quiet, something becomes visible. The patterns, the fears, the reactions, the parts of you that were being activated. And this is where transformation begins. Not in the connection itself, but in the space created by its absence. Because it is in that space that both individuals begin to shift. Not always consciously, not always in a way that is immediately visible, but gradually, internally. And this is why the runner leaving is not the end. It is the beginning of something deeper. A process that cannot happen in closeness. Because closeness was amplifying everything. But now, there is space. And in that space, there is the possibility for alignment. So if you look back at the moment they left, and it felt sudden, confusing, unexpected, understand this. It was not random. It was not because something failed. It was because something was activated that had not yet been integrated. And the only way to integrate it was to create distance, not to lose the connection, but to make it possible. Because without that distance, nothing would change. The same intensity, the same reactions, the same imbalance would continue. But now, there is space for something new. A shift that does not happen through effort, but through awareness, through understanding, through the gradual process of becoming stable within yourself. And once that stability is there, the dynamic changes. Not because the connection is different, but because the way you experience it is. And that is what makes everything possible. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of stability. And that is something the runner needed before they could stay. Not because they didn't care, but because they did, in a way they could not yet hold. And that is the truth behind why they left. Not to end the connection, but to create the space where it could eventually become real. Chapter 3. The hidden dynamic: how the chaser creates the chase without realizing it. There is a moment in this journey where something uncomfortable begins to surface. Not about them, but about you. Because up until this point, it may have felt clear. They ran. You stayed. They pulled away. You tried to understand. It seemed like a simple dynamic. One person avoids. The other pursues. One is the runner. The other is the chaser. And naturally, this creates a story. They are the one creating distance. They are the reason this is happening. If they changed, everything would be different. But here is where the deeper truth begins to emerge. The runner does not exist without the chaser. And the chaser does not exist without the runner. They are not separate roles. They are reflections of the same imbalance. And once you begin to see this, everything changes. Because the question is no longer, why are they running? It becomes, what is creating the need to run? And that is where the answer shifts inward. Not as blame, but as awareness. Think about what chasing actually is. It is not just physical pursuit. It is not just reaching out, messaging, or trying to reconnect. Chasing is energetic. It is where your attention lives, where your focus goes, where your energy is directed. If your thoughts are constantly on them, if your emotions are tied to what they are doing, if your sense of peace depends on the connection moving forward, you are chasing, even if you are not doing anything externally. And that internal movement creates energy. Energy that is not grounded. Energy that is reaching outward. Energy that carries expectation. Because beneath that focus, there is a belief that something needs to happen, that something is not yet complete, that something outside of you is required for you to feel settled. And that belief creates pressure, not visible pressure, not something you are consciously expressing, but something that is felt. Because energy is not contained within your thoughts. It radiates. It influences the dynamic. And this is where the misunderstanding happens. Because from your perspective, you're just feeling something, just trying to understand, just wanting clarity. But from an energetic perspective, you are reaching. And reaching creates imbalance. Because your energy is not with you. It is extended. And when energy is extended, it creates tension. And tension creates resistance. This is why the more you focus on the connection, the more it seems to move away. The more you try to understand it, the less clear it becomes. The more you want closeness, the more distance appears. Not because the connection is fading, but because the energy is not balanced. Because one side is reaching, and the other is responding to that reach. Not consciously, not intentionally, but instinctively. Because when someone feels pressure, their natural response is to create space. Even if they don't understand why. Even if they don't consciously realize what they are doing. They feel something, and they respond. And that response is distance. This is the hidden dynamic. The one that most people do not see. Because it is not about actions. It is about energy. And energy does not lie. It reflects exactly what is happening beneath the surface. So if you are in a state of seeking, of needing, of wanting something to happen, that state is being felt. And it shapes the connection. It creates the conditions that keep the runner running. Not because they want to leave, but because there is something to move away from. And that something is not you as a person. It is the energy within the dynamic, the imbalance, the pressure, the expectation. And this is where the shift begins. Because once you see this clearly, you stop focusing on what they are doing and begin to look at what you are creating, not as blame, but as responsibility. Because responsibility gives you power. Not power to control them, but power to change the dynamic. Because if the dynamic is created by imbalance, then balance is what dissolves it. And balance begins within you. When your energy is no longer reaching. When your attention is no longer extended outward. When your sense of peace is no longer dependent on the connection. You stop chasing. Not as an action, but as a state. A state where you are no longer seeking something outside of you. And in that state, everything changes. Because there is no longer pressure. No longer expectation. No longer something to run from. And when there is nothing to run from, the runner does not need to run. This is the turning point. Not when they come back, but when you stop chasing. Because that is when the dynamic dissolves. Not gradually, but completely. Because the roles were never fixed. They were created by imbalance. And once that imbalance is gone, the roles no longer exist. There is no runner. No chaser. Only two individuals. Both grounded. Both stable. Both no longer reacting from patterns. And this is where real connection begins. Not in the intensity of chasing. Not in the movement of running. But in the stillness of alignment. Where nothing needs to happen. Where nothing needs to be forced. Where nothing is being pulled or pushed. Only something is allowed. And that allowance is what creates union. Not because you made it happen, but because you stopped creating the conditions that kept it from happening. So if you find yourself still focused on what they are doing, still trying to understand why they are running, pause and ask yourself, where is my energy? Is it with me? Or is it still reaching outward? Because the answer to that question is the answer to everything. Because the moment your energy returns to you is the moment the dynamic begins to change. Not because they changed, but because you did. And that is the truth. The chaser does not need to stop chasing physically. They need to stop chasing energetically. Because once that happens, there is nothing left to run from. And when there is nothing left to run from, the runner has nowhere to go. Except back. Not because they were pulled, but because the space has finally become safe. And that is what changes everything. Not the act of chasing, but the moment it ends. Within you. Chapter 4. What changes during separation? The invisible work that rewrites everything. There is a phase in this journey that looks like nothing is happening. No contact. No movement. No clear signs that anything is changing. And because of that, it is easy to believe that everything has stopped. That the connection is paused. That progress has slowed down or even disappeared. But this is one of the greatest misunderstandings. Because this is not the phase where nothing happens. This is the phase where everything happens. Just not in the way you expect. Not externally, but internally. And this internal shift is what determines everything that comes next. Think about how the connection felt before separation. There was intensity, emotion, movement. You were constantly reacting to what they said, to what they didn't say, to how things changed from one moment to the next. Your experience was not stable. It was dynamic, shifting, driven by interaction. And because of that, your attention was always outward, focused on the connection, trying to understand it, trying to keep up with it, trying to find clarity within it. But when separation begins, that external movement disappears. There is no interaction, no immediate feedback, no constant input, and suddenly you are left with yourself, your thoughts, your emotions, your patterns. At first, this can feel overwhelming, because without distraction, everything that was previously hidden becomes visible. The thoughts you didn't notice, the emotions you didn't fully process, the patterns you were unconsciously repeating, they all rise to the surface. Not because something new has been created, but because the space now exists for you to see them. And this is the beginning of the internal shift. Because you are no longer reacting. You are observing. You begin to notice how often your mind returns to the connection. How often your thoughts are trying to understand something. How often your emotions shift based on what you imagine is happening. And in that observation, awareness begins. Not forced awareness. Not something you try to create. But something that naturally emerges when there is space. And that awareness is what starts to change everything. Because once you see a pattern, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize it in real time. You begin to notice when you are reacting, when you are seeking, when you are attaching meaning to something. And slowly, without effort, your response begins to shift. Not because you are trying to change, but because you understand. And understanding changes your relationship to your experience. You are no longer inside the pattern. You are aware of it. And that awareness creates distance. Not physical distance, but emotional distance. The kind that allows you to see clearly, instead of reacting automatically. This is where the deeper transformation begins. Because the goal is not to stop feeling. It is not to suppress emotion. It is not to disconnect from the connection. The goal is to become stable within it. To experience it without losing yourself. To feel without being controlled by the feeling. And that stability is developed in separation, not in closeness. Because closeness amplifies everything. It intensifies emotion. It triggers reaction. It keeps you in the experience. But separation slows everything down. It creates stillness. And in that stillness, you begin to return to yourself. Your attention is no longer divided. It is no longer extended outward. It begins to come back. Back to your life. Back to your experience. Back to your present moment. And this return is gradual. You don't notice it all at once. But over time, you realize that you are thinking less, reacting less, needing less. And this is where the real shift happens. Not in what you do, but in how you are. Your state changes. From reactive to present. From seeking to grounded. From needing to allowing. And that change in state is what rewrites the dynamic. Because the dynamic was never created by actions. It was created by energy. And your energy is no longer the same. It is no longer reaching. It is no longer dependent. It is no longer tied to what is happening externally. It is stable, centered, and that stability changes everything, even if nothing has changed on the surface, because the connection responds to your state, not your thoughts, not your intentions, but your state. And your state is different now. You are no longer the person who entered separation. You are no longer operating from the same patterns. You are no longer reacting in the same way. You have shifted. And that shift is what makes everything possible. Not immediately. Not always in a way you can see. But inevitably. Because once your internal state changes, the external experience cannot remain the same. It has to adjust. It has to reflect what you have become. And this is why separation is so important. Because without this phase, nothing would change. The same patterns would continue. The same dynamic would repeat. The same imbalance would remain. But separation interrupts that. It creates the space needed for transformation. The kind of transformation that does not happen through effort, but through awareness, through presence, through the gradual process of becoming stable within yourself. So if you find yourself in separation, and it feels like nothing is happening, look deeper. Because everything is happening, just not where you are used to looking. It is happening within you, in the quiet, in the stillness, in the moments where there is no distraction. And in that space, you are becoming someone different. Someone who is no longer defined by the connection, but able to experience it from a place of stability. And that is what changes everything. Not what happens externally, but what changes within you. Because the moment your internal state shifts is the moment the entire dynamic begins to rewrite itself. Not because you forced it, but because you became someone who no longer needs to. And that is the invisible work of separation. The part that no one sees, but the part that determines everything. Chapter 5. The moment you stop needing them when the connection finally breathes. There is a point in this journey that feels almost impossible when you first hear about it. The idea that one day you will no longer need them. Not because you stop caring. Not because the connection disappears. Not because something becomes less meaningful. But because something within you becomes complete. And at first, this idea can feel uncomfortable. Because the entire journey may have felt like it was leading toward them. Toward closeness. Toward reunion. Toward a moment where everything finally makes sense. So how could not needing them be part of that path? How could the absence of need lead to something deeper instead of something less? This is where the truth begins to reveal itself. Because the need you felt earlier in the journey was never about love. It was about lack. It was the belief that something outside of you was required for you to feel whole. And that belief shaped everything. It shaped how you thought, how you felt, how you experienced the connection. It created attachment, expectation, a sense that something had to happen, that something had to change, that something was missing until it did. And that feeling of missing created movement. It made you focus on the connection. Think about it constantly. Try to understand it. Try to reach it. And that movement is what we call chasing. Not because you were doing something wrong, but because your energy was not at rest. It was reaching, trying to complete something that felt incomplete. And that reaching created pressure. Even if it was subtle. Even if you were not expressing it outwardly. It was there. Because need always carries weight. It always creates a sense that something is not yet right. And that weight is felt in the connection. Not through words. Not through actions. But through energy. And that energy is what the runner responds to. Not consciously, but instinctively. Because when something feels like it needs to happen, it creates tension. And tension creates resistance. And resistance creates distance. This is why the dynamic exists. Not because one person loves more, but because one person needs more. And that need creates imbalance. But then something begins to change. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But gradually. You start to feel different. You notice that you are not thinking about them as much. Not because you are trying to stop, but because the thoughts are no longer as strong. You notice that your emotions are more stable. Less reactive. Less dependent on what is happening externally. You begin to feel okay. Not because the connection has changed, but because you have. And this is where the shift happens. You no longer need them. Not in the way you did before. You can still feel the connection. You can still care. You can still recognize its significance. But you are no longer depending on it to feel complete. And that changes everything. Because when you are no longer in a state of need, your energy shifts. It returns to you. It becomes grounded, centered, at rest. You are no longer reaching. No longer projecting your attention outward. No longer trying to make something happen. You are simply present. And presence removes pressure. It removes the subtle energy that was keeping the dynamic unstable. Because there is no longer expectation. No longer the belief that something must happen. no longer the sense that something is missing. And without those things, there is nothing to resist, nothing to create distance from, nothing to run from. And this is where the connection finally breathes. For the first time, it is not being influenced by need. It is not being shaped by expectation. It is not being pulled or pushed. It is free. Free to exist. Free to move. Free to align. And this is the paradox. The moment you stop needing them is the moment the connection becomes possible. Not because you gave up, but because you removed the only thing that was preventing it. Your dependence. Your attachment. Your belief that something outside of you is required. And this is what creates balance. Because now, you are not reaching. And if you are not reaching, there is nothing to run from. The dynamic dissolves. Naturally. Without effort. Without needing to change anything externally. Because the change has already happened. Within you. And this is why this stage feels so different. Because it does not feel like you are doing anything. It feels like you are doing less. Thinking less. Reacting less. Needing less. And yet everything is changing. Because your state is different. And your state is what creates your experience. So if you find yourself in a place where you no longer feel the same urgency, where you are not thinking about them constantly, where you feel calm even without answers, do not question it. Do not think that you are losing something. Recognize what is actually happening. You are no longer in a state of lack. You are no longer seeking completion outside of yourself. You are whole. And that wholeness is what makes real connection possible. Not the kind of connection that is driven by need, but the kind that exists without it. The kind that is stable, balanced, real. Because it is no longer trying to fill a gap. It is simply expressing what is already there. And that is the difference between needing someone and choosing them. Because when you no longer need them, you are free. Free to experience the connection without attachment. Free to allow things to unfold without control. Free to meet them as you are. Not as someone trying to become something else. And that is what changes everything. Not their return. Not the moment of reunion. But the moment you stop needing it. Because that is the moment where everything becomes possible. Not through effort. Not through waiting. But through being. And from that place, the connection is no longer something you are trying to reach. It is something that can finally meet you, where you already are. And that is what makes it real. Not that you need them, but that you no longer do. And that is the moment where everything begins. Chapter 6. Why the runner feels safe to return when pressure disappears. There is a quiet moment in this journey that most people do not recognize. Not because it is hidden, but because it does not look like what you expect. No message suddenly appears. No dramatic change announces itself. No clear sign tells you that something is shifting. And yet something has. The energy has changed. Not outwardly, but inwardly. And that internal shift is what creates everything that follows. To understand why the runner feels safe to return, you have to look at what made them leave. Not on the surface, but beneath it. Because the runner did not leave simply because of circumstances. They left because of how the connection felt. Not the connection itself, but the energy within it. Earlier in the journey, the connection was intense, emotionally charged, full of movement. You were thinking about it constantly, trying to understand it, trying to hold on to it, trying to make sense of something that felt beyond logic. And beneath all of that, there was a subtle pressure, not always expressed, not always visible, but present. The pressure of expectation, the pressure of wanting something to happen, the pressure of needing clarity. And that pressure created tension. Even if you were not doing anything outwardly, even if you were trying to stay calm, the energy was still there. Because energy is not defined by action. It is defined by state. And your state was not at rest. It was reaching, seeking, trying to resolve something. And that created an environment that was not stable. Because when there is pressure, there is resistance. And resistance creates distance. This is why the runner pulled away. Not because they did not feel the connection, but because they felt the pressure within it. And that pressure made it difficult to stay. Because something within them was not yet stable enough to hold that intensity. So they created space. Not as a decision, but as a response. And that response became the dynamic. The more pressure they felt, the more distance they created. The more distance they created, the more you felt the need to understand. And the cycle continued. Until something changed. Not externally, but internally. And that change begins with you. Because at some point, the need starts to dissolve. Not because you forced it, but because you reached a place where something settles within you. You are no longer trying to understand everything. You are no longer waiting in the same way. You are no longer focused on what they are doing. And because of that, your energy changes. It becomes quiet, still, grounded. You are no longer reaching, no longer projecting expectation, no longer creating the sense that something must happen. And in that absence, the pressure disappears. And this is the moment everything begins to shift. Because without pressure, there is nothing to resist. Nothing to create distance from. Nothing to run from. The environment of the connection changes. Not because something external happened, but because the energy within it has become stable. And this stability creates safety. Not safety in a physical sense, but energetic safety. The kind that allows someone to be present, without feeling overwhelmed. The kind that allows someone to stay, without needing to create space. Because there is no longer tension, no longer expectation, no longer something they feel they need to escape from. And this is why the runner feels safe to return. Not because they suddenly changed, not because they made a conscious decision, but because the environment of the connection has changed. And that environment is created by your state. Think about what safety actually is. It is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of pressure. It is the ability to exist in a space, without needing to react, without feeling overwhelmed, without needing to protect yourself. And this is what your energy now provides. Because you are no longer seeking, no longer needing, no longer trying to control what happens. You are simply present. And presence does not create pressure. It creates space. And space is what allows everything to unfold. Naturally. Without force. Without resistance. And this is why the runner's return does not feel dramatic. It does not feel like a sudden change. Because it is not. It is a response to something that has already shifted. Something that has already become stable. And this is why it often feels quiet. Almost unexpected. Because you are no longer waiting for it. You are no longer focused on when it will happen. You are no longer projecting your attention into the future. You are here, fully present in your life. And from that place, the return does not feel like a solution. It feels like a continuation of something that has already settled within you. And this is the truth most people miss. The runner does not return when you want them to. They return when there is nothing left to run from. And that has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with you. With your state. With your energy. With whether you are still creating pressure. Or have finally released it. So if you find yourself in a place where everything feels calm. Where you are no longer trying to make something happen. Where your attention is fully with your life. Do not think that nothing is happening. Recognize what is actually happening. You have created the conditions for alignment. Not through effort, but through release. Not by doing something, but by no longer doing what was creating resistance. And from that place, everything begins to move. Not because you forced it, but because you finally allowed it. And that is what makes the runner feel safe. Not your words. Not your actions. but your absence of pressure, your presence, your stability. Because the moment the connection becomes a place of peace, instead of tension, is the moment there is nothing left to run from. And when there is nothing left to run from, the runner has no reason to stay away. They return, not because you pulled them, but because the space has finally become safe. And that is what changes everything. Not the return itself, but the state that made it possible. Chapter 7. The return doesn't look like fantasy, it looks like truth. There is a moment in this journey that most people imagine long before it ever arrives. A moment that feels almost cinematic. The runner returns. They say the right things. Everything becomes clear. You imagine intensity, emotion overflowing, words that explain everything. A sense that all the confusion finally dissolves. You imagine it feeling undeniable. Like a peak. Like a climax. Like the moment where everything reaches its highest point. But when the return actually happens, it feels different. Not less meaningful, but less dramatic. And this is where many people become confused. Because what they experience does not match what they expected. It feels quieter, more grounded, almost ordinary. And the mind immediately questions it. Is this really it? Why doesn't it feel the same? Where is the intensity one thought I would feel? But this is where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself. Because the fantasy was never real. The intensity you imagined was not union. It was memory. It was based on how the connection felt before. During the stage of activation. When everything was new. When emotions were high. When the connection was pulling everything to the surface. That intensity felt powerful. But it was unstable. It was driven by reaction. By patterns being triggered. By emotions rising faster than they could be understood. And because of that, it created a very specific imprint. An expectation of what the connection should feel like. But that stage was never meant to last. It was part of the process. The part that brought everything into awareness. The part that activated what needed to change. But union is not activation. It is integration. And integration feels different. It does not create emotional waves. It settles them. It does not overwhelm you. It grounds you. It does not pull you into the experience. It allows you to remain fully within yourself. And this is why the return feels quiet. Because you are no longer experiencing the connection through reaction. You are experiencing it through presence. And presence does not feel dramatic. It feels stable. Think about it. When something is unstable, you feel it constantly. You notice every shift. Every change affects you. But when something is stable, you don't question it. You don't analyze it. You don't need constant confirmation that it is there. You simply know. And that knowing is quiet. It does not create emotional noise. It does not demand your attention. It allows you to remain grounded. And this is what the return actually feels like. Not a peak. Not an explosion of emotion. But a settling. A coming into balance. Where nothing feels forced. Nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels like it has to prove itself. And this can feel unfamiliar. Because the mind is used to intensity. Used to movement. Used to the push and pull. So when that disappears, it can feel like something is missing. But what is missing is the instability, the emotional highs and lows, the patterns that created the intensity. And without those things, what remains is truth. Not the truth you imagined, but the truth that exists when everything is stable. And this truth is simple. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be overwhelming. It simply is. And this is what makes it real. Because real connection does not need intensity to exist. It does not need emotional waves to validate it. It does not need constant movement to feel alive. It exists in stillness, in presence, in a space where nothing needs to be proven. And this is what you are stepping into. Not the fantasy. but the truth, a version of the connection that is no longer defined by what it felt like before, but by what it has become. And this requires a shift in perspective, because you are no longer looking for intensity as proof. You are recognizing stability as truth. You are no longer expecting something to feel overwhelming. You are allowing it to feel natural. And that changes how you experience everything. You are not reacting. You are not analyzing. You are not trying to understand what this means. You are simply present. And in that presence, everything becomes clear. Not in a dramatic way, but in a grounded, steady way. You realize that the return was never meant to be a moment of intensity. It was meant to be a moment of alignment. A moment where everything settles into place. Not because something new was created, but because everything that needed to change already has, within you. And because of that, the experience cannot feel the same. You are not the same person. You are no longer reacting from the same patterns. You are no longer seeking the same things. You are stable. And stability changes how everything feels. So if the return feels quieter than you expected, if it feels less intense, less overwhelming, do not question it. Do not try to recreate the old feeling. Do not think that something is missing. Recognize what is actually happening. You are no longer in the fantasy. You are in the truth. And the truth does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be overwhelming. It does not need to prove itself. It simply exists. And that is what makes it real. Not the intensity. Not the emotion. Not the story you imagined. But the quiet, grounded presence that remains. When everything has finally aligned. And that is the moment where the connection becomes what it was always meant to be. Not something you chase. Not something you try to understand. But something you simply experience. As it is. Without needing it to be anything more. Chapter 8. You don't react the same way anymore, and that changes everything. There is a moment in this journey that does not feel dramatic, yet it marks one of the most important shifts. Nothing external needs to change for you to notice it. No message. No reunion. No clear confirmation. And yet something feels completely different. You don't react the same way anymore. Situations that once triggered strong emotions now feel quieter. Silence no longer creates anxiety. Uncertainty no longer pulls you into overthinking. And this is where the real transformation becomes undeniable. Because earlier in the journey, your experience was driven by reaction. Every change in the connection created a response. If they reached out, you felt relief. If they pulled away, you felt confusion. If something was unclear, your mind tried to solve it. Your emotional state was tied to what was happening externally. And because of that, you were constantly moving. Emotionally. Mentally. Energetically. There was no stillness. No space. Only reaction. But now something has shifted. The same situations do not create the same response. You can think about them without being overwhelmed. You can experience uncertainty without needing to resolve it. You can feel the connection without needing to act on it. And this is where everything changes. Because reaction is what creates instability. It is what keeps the dynamic moving. It is what creates the push and pull. But when reaction disappears, stability takes its place. And stability is what allows real connection to exist. Think about what reaction actually is. It is an automatic response. A pattern. Something that happens without conscious awareness. It is driven by emotion. By past experiences. By beliefs that you may not even realize are influencing you. And earlier in the journey, these reactions were strong. They defined your experience. You were not just feeling the connection. You were responding to it. Trying to understand it. Trying to control it. Trying to make sense of something that felt unpredictable. And that created movement. Constant movement. But now, you are not reacting. You are observing. And that difference is everything. Because observation creates space. Space between what happens. and how you respond to it. And in that space, you have choice. You are no longer pulled into automatic reactions. You are no longer controlled by emotion. You are present, grounded, aware. And that awareness changes how you experience everything. You are not caught in the connection. You are within yourself. And from that place, the connection feels different. Not because it changed, but because your relationship to it has changed. You are no longer trying to define it. No longer trying to understand every detail. No longer trying to reach a specific outcome. You are simply experiencing it as it is, without needing it to be anything else. And this is what creates stability. Because stability is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of reactivity. It is the ability to feel something without being controlled by it. And that is the state you are in now. A state where you can experience the connection without losing yourself, without being pulled into emotional cycles, without needing something to happen. And that changes everything, because the dynamic was never created by the connection itself. It was created by reaction, by how each person responded to what they felt. One person reacted by moving closer. The other reacted by creating distance. And that created imbalance. But now, that reaction is gone. At least on your side. You are no longer chasing. No longer trying to close the gap. No longer responding to every shift. And because of that, the dynamic begins to change. Not because you forced it, but because you are no longer creating the conditions that sustain it. And this is what makes this stage so powerful. Because it does not require effort. It does not require action. It does not require you to do anything differently externally. It only requires that your state has changed internally. And your state has changed. You are calmer, more grounded, less attached to outcomes, less focused on what the connection needs to become, and more focused on your own experience. And that focus creates balance, because your energy is no longer extended outward. It is centered, stable. And stable energy does not create imbalance. It does not create pressure. It does not create something to react to. It simply exists. And from that place, everything becomes clearer. You are no longer trying to interpret what is happening. You are no longer questioning every detail. You are no longer looking for meaning in every interaction. You are simply present. And presence removes distortion. It allows you to see things as they are. Not through the lens of emotion. Not through the lens of expectation. But clearly. And this clarity changes everything. Because you are no longer reacting to what you think is happening. You are experiencing what is actually happening. And that difference is what creates stability. So if you find yourself in a place where you are not reacting the same way, where things that once felt intense now feel calm, where you are no longer pulled into the same patterns, do not question it. Do not think that something is missing. Recognize what is actually happening. You have changed. Not externally, but internally. Your state is different. Your awareness is deeper. Your presence is stronger. And that is what changes everything. Because the connection does not respond to your actions. It responds to your state. And your state is no longer reactive. It is stable. And stability is what allows real connection to exist. Not the kind driven by emotion. Not the kind shaped by patterns. But the kind that remains. Quietly. Steadily. Without needing to prove itself. And that is the moment where everything becomes real. Not when something dramatic happens. But when nothing needs to. Because you are no longer reacting. You are simply being. And from that place, everything else aligns. Naturally. Without effort. Because you are no longer creating movement. You are allowing stillness. And in that stillness, everything finds its place. Chapter 9. The truth they didn't come back because they changed, you stopped pushing them away. There is a realization in this journey that can feel uncomfortable at first. Not because it is negative, but because it challenges everything you thought you understood. For so long, it may have felt like the return depended on them, on when they would be ready, on when they would understand, on when they would finally come back. It seemed like they were the one holding the key, the one who had to change, the one who had to take the step. And until they did, everything remained paused. But what if that is not how it works? What if their return was never about them changing first? What if it was about something else entirely? This is where the truth begins to shift. Because the connection is not controlled by actions. It is shaped by energy. And energy does not move based on decisions. It moves based on alignment. So when the runner returns, it is not because they suddenly became different. It is because the dynamic that kept them away no longer exists. And that dynamic was not created by one person. It was created by imbalance, by the interaction between two energies that were not yet stable. Earlier in the journey, your energy may have been reaching, trying to understand, trying to connect, trying to make sense of what was happening. And even if you were not doing anything externally, internally, there was movement. There was focus. There was a sense that something needed to happen. And that created pressure. Not visible pressure. Not something you were consciously expressing, but something that was felt. Because energy is not hidden. It reflects your state. And your state was not at rest. It was seeking, trying to close a gap, trying to resolve something that felt incomplete. And that incompleteness created tension. A subtle sense that something was missing, that something had to change. And that tension is what the runner responded to. Not consciously, not intentionally, but instinctively. Because when something feels like it needs to happen, it creates resistance. It creates a sense that there is something to move away from. And that is why they ran. Not from you, but from the energy within the connection, the intensity, the expectation, the imbalance. And as long as that energy existed, the dynamic remained the same. No matter what happened externally, no matter how much time passed, no matter how much you tried to understand it, the outcome did not change. Because the underlying energy did not change. But then something shifted. Not in them. In you. Gradually. Quietly. Without needing to force anything. You stopped focusing in the same way. You stopped trying to understand everything. You stopped waiting for something to happen. And because of that, your energy changed. It returned to you. It became grounded. Stable. At rest. And when your energy is at rest, there is no pressure, no expectation, no sense that something must happen. And without that pressure, there is nothing to resist, nothing to run from, nothing creating distance. And this is the moment everything changes. Because the dynamic dissolves. Not because someone decided to change, but because the conditions that created it no longer exist. And from that place, the runner does not need to run. There is nothing pulling, nothing pushing, nothing creating imbalance. Only space, only stability. And in that space, they return, not as a reaction, not as a sudden decision, but as a natural response to the absence of resistance. And this is why their return feels different. Because it is not driven by the same energy. It is not part of the same dynamic. It is not the continuation of the push and pull. It is the result of its end. And this is why it feels quieter, less intense, more grounded. Because you are no longer experiencing it through reaction. You are experiencing it through presence. And presence does not create emotional waves. It creates clarity. It allows things to exist without needing to define them. And this is what makes the connection real. Not the moment they come back, but the state you are in when they do. A state where you are no longer pushing them away. Not physically, but energetically. Because pushing someone away is not always about action. It is about pressure, about expectation, about the subtle sense that something needs to happen. And when that disappears, the space becomes safe. Safe enough for them to return. Safe enough for the connection to exist. Safe enough for something stable to form. And this is the truth. They did not come back because they changed first. They came back because you stopped creating the conditions that kept them away. And that shift is everything. Because it means the power was never outside of you. It was always in your state, in your energy, in whether you were reaching or allowing. So if you find yourself looking at their return as proof that something changed in them, pause and look deeper. Because the real change happened before that moment. Within you. In the way you think. The way you feel. The way you experience the connection. You are no longer the same person. You are no longer operating from the same patterns. You are no longer creating the same energy. And that is what made the return possible. Not their decision, but your alignment. Because once you are aligned, there is nothing left to push away. Nothing left to resist. Nothing left to run from. And from that place, everything comes together. Not because you made it happen, but because you stopped preventing it. And that is the truth that changes everything. Not that they came back, but that you became someone they no longer needed to leave. Chapter 10. The final truth union is not about their return, it's about your state. There is a final realization in this journey that changes everything you thought you were waiting. 4. It does not arrive as a dramatic insight. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels quiet, almost obvious. And yet, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The return was never the point. Not the message. Not the conversation. Not even the moment you see each other again. Because none of those things are what create union. They are only reflections of something that has already happened. Within you. For so long, it may have felt like everything depended on that moment. The moment they come back. The moment everything makes sense. The moment the connection becomes real in a way that cannot be questioned. You may have believed that once that moment arrived, everything would change. That you would finally feel settled. That the confusion would disappear. That the journey would reach its destination. But now something feels different. You are no longer waiting in the same way. You are not imagining that moment with the same intensity. You are not holding on to the idea that something has to happen for you to feel complete. And that is where the truth reveals itself. Because the feeling you thought would come from their return is already here. Not because they returned, but because you changed. You became someone who no longer needs that moment to feel whole. And that changes everything. Because the entire journey was never about them coming back. It was about you returning to yourself. Think about how your experience used to feel. The constant thinking. The emotional intensity. The need to understand what was happening. You were focused on the connection. Trying to interpret every detail. Trying to figure out what it meant. And beneath all of that, there was a belief that something outside of you was required. That something had to happen in order for you to feel settled. And that belief created movement. It made you reach. It made you wait. It made you attach meaning to things that were uncertain. And that movement created imbalance. Because your energy was not at rest. It was directed outward. Trying to close a gap. Trying to reach a future moment. But now that gap no longer exists. Because you are not projecting your attention into the future. You are here. Fully present. Fully grounded in your own experience. And from that place, there is nothing missing. And when nothing is missing, there is nothing to chase. Nothing to wait for. Nothing to complete. And that is the state of union. Not the physical coming together, but the internal alignment. The state where you are whole within yourself. Where your sense of peace is not dependent on anything external. Where your experience is not shaped by what has not yet happened. And this is what most people misunderstand. They believe that union is created by two people coming together. But in reality, union is created by one person becoming aligned. Because once you are aligned, everything else reflects that. Not immediately. Not always in the way you expect. But inevitably. Because the connection is not separate from you. It mirrors your state. And your state has changed. You are no longer seeking. No longer reacting. No longer trying to control what happens. You are simply present. And presence removes resistance. It removes the subtle energy that was keeping the connection unstable. Because resistance is not always obvious. It is not always about what you do. It is about what you believe. The belief that something is missing. The belief that something needs to happen. The belief that your experience depends on something outside of you. And those beliefs create tension. They create a sense of not yet. And that sense is what keeps everything in motion. But now, that belief is gone. You are not living in not yet. You are living in now. And in that state, everything is already complete. Not externally, but internally. And internal completion is what allows external alignment. So when the runner comes back, it is not the beginning of union. It is the reflection of it. It is the visible expression of something that has already happened within you. And this is why it feels different. Because you are not experiencing it as a solution. You are experiencing it as a continuation of something that is already stable, already grounded, already complete. And this changes how you meet them. You are not reacting. You are not overwhelmed. You are not trying to make something happen. You are simply there, present. And that presence is what creates real connection. Because real connection does not come from need. It comes from wholeness. From two individuals who are no longer trying to get something from each other, but are simply sharing what they already are. And that is the final truth. Union is not about their return. It is about your state. Because your state is what determines everything. Not what they do. Not what happens externally. But who you are within yourself. And once that is aligned, everything else follows. Not because you made it happen, but because there is nothing left to stop it. So if you find yourself no longer waiting, no longer seeking, no longer needing that moment to feel complete, do not question it. Do not think that you have lost something. Recognize what is actually happening. You have reached the state that makes union possible. Not by chasing it, but by becoming it. And from that place, everything else becomes simple. Not because the journey was easy, but because you are no longer looking for something to complete it. You are already there. And that is what changes everything. Not the moment they come back, but the moment you realize you never needed them to.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.